Joining us, I24 News senior diplomatic correspondent Guy Israel, I24 News' senior Middle East correspondent Ariel Osseron, and Mr. Dan Perry, international affairs analyst. Gentlemen, very, very happy to be with you here today. We really cannot undermine the importance of such an operation. But if we are looking at the current state of the deal, what's the effect?
As David Sur said, this is a tactical success, and as Ariel said, it's almost Hollywoodian in the details of it, and as more and more details come out, there's a movie in all this. And it's a day of joy for the four families and for all of Israel, of course, tempered, obviously, by the reported death of the commander. But does it change the big picture? Is Hamas going to now be demoralized? I doubt that. So it's a rare instance of good news and satisfaction for Israel. It does show that special forces and intelligence still have capacities, but as David Sur said, in the grand scheme of things, it's been almost 9 months, and Israel's rescued 7 hostages out of 120 that remain. So probably strategically, it doesn't really move the needle. Much depends in coming days on whether Hamas responds positively to the deal. It's on the table.
Hamas issued an official statement in the name of its leader Ismail Haniyeh, starting with accusing Israel of continuing to conduct its massacres in the Gaza Strip. According to Gazans, the Hamas-controlled health ministry, the latest official numbers are 55 killed in Nuseirat since the start of this morning, but unofficial numbers are much higher than that, and that is the narrative that Hamas is trying to push today, that they're trying to diminish from Israel's success of releasing hostages that it itself
acknowledge,
kidnapped.
however, that hostages were rescued, or in their messaging, that fact is...
So I'll just finish what Haniyeh said, saying that the movement, Hamas, will not agree to any agreement that does not achieve security for the Palestinian people. That does not indicate any shift in Hamas's position regarding the negotiations.
I have to say, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Hamas is right that this doesn't move the needle in the grand scheme of things, but Hamas is revealing its a journalist shouldn't use this word, but it's absolute evil when it says that it won't stop until the security of the Palestinian people is assured. I mean, what endangers the Palestinian people more than the war that Hamas started and that they refused to end, which they could do? I'm sure that they could negotiate safe passage for Sinwar if they wanted to. They could end the war tomorrow by forking over the other hostages and sadly the bodies that remain and laying down their arms, because they know very well that not only can Israel not accept them staying in power in Gaza, but no nation on the face of this earth would. It's basically open and shut. And so this message by Hamas, I mean, it just reveals the utter mendacity and rank immorality, and one cannot be shocked, but it somehow flirts with the shock.
It's still shocking.
Yeah, exactly.
Still shocking.
Yeah, Israeli special forces didn't need to operate in the heart of Nuseirat, a refugee camp in Gaza, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, if Hamas hadn't kidnapped Israeli citizens.
Yes, it's not our idea of a fun Saturday. Yeah.
What is again important to remember when we hear the story of Noah and the other 3, as we understand,
they were
all first separated, but all were in residential homes, were in homes of Gazan residents, of civilians who held them in their homes together with the Hamas terrorists. Another illustration of what we saw on October 7th, where over 1,000 Hamas terrorists, but also many thousands of civilians who took part in this massacre, who decided to go out of their homes on that October 7th once they heard of the massacre, and decided to join the bloodbath of Israelis and even take a Jewish person home. Grab a Noah and keep her in your room.
The second wave of invaders was all civilians, and the third wave was, unfortunately, civilians in Gaza City who rejoiced by the many thousands.
Who smashed the skulls of Israeli bodies.
This is a situation that requires some self-control, because you can't conclude that every child in Gaza is guilty. On the other hand, you just can't, and you can't do collective punishment. On the other hand, it's also true that the population in Gaza is so brainwashed after 17, 18 years. The hatred of Israel is so severe and deep and real that indeed it's
But
not
also
just
the argument of Hamas that it cannot vouch for all the hostages because they simply do not know where they all are.
It is quite pathetic and cynical of Hamas to be complaining about civilian casualties when Hamas is the one that entrenches these hostages in the homes of civilians.
And yet we're convincing one another, gentlemen, as if we're
well,
not convinced.
but you know what?
Yeah.
There are some legal proceedings underway in the world, and I think it bears noting that even though the proceedings at the ICJ and at the ICC...
Yes, against the Israeli Prime Minister and the Israeli Defense Minister.
It's political, nonsensical, and highly selective. But on the other hand, if you do want to engage with these legal proceedings on a legalistic grounds and not just propaganda all day, the fact is these civilian installations, the minute they're used for such purposes, become legitimate military targets under war crimes jurisprudence.
I think we've come to terms with the less of a feasibility, let's put it as such, of a definitive military victory. But if we're talking about a diplomatic victory, is there one, Mr. Perry?
I've been saying for a long time that the grand design Biden is offering Israel, which may require Israel to allow Hamas in a much diminished and degraded state to somehow remain in Gaza, may be the optimal thing, and it is excruciating. Because allowing Hamas to remain in any way, shape, or form is obviously a bad thing, but it could come in the context of something that is, in fact, a form of victory. If the war ends, if the hostages all return, if normalization of peace with Saudi Arabia is the result, if Hamas is deterred and Israel is understood to have legitimacy to resume the war upon any provocation, that may be the best that we can hope for.
Well,
it's not
many
great,
ifs,
but it may be the least bad.
How does it all affect, if at all, what we are to see from this point onwards, Mr. Perry?
We know, we can't much discuss it, but we know that there is a lot of intelligence about many hostages where they are.
Yes.
And in most cases, the military and the Shin Bet can't operate. So this is a case where it worked out, and that is to be celebrated. But does it change the big picture? Sadly, probably not. And as Ariel was saying, I think as you, Ellie, were alluding, I mean, the big picture is that Hamas purposely puts these civilians, has kidnapped Israeli civilians, and puts Palestinian civilians in harm's way, precisely in order to bring about what happened today.
A win-win in the most cynical fashion.
In the most diabolical fashion. Cynicism is too mild a word for what is going on.
I agree.
I think it should be stated very clearly so that people don't forget. Hamas wants Palestinian civilians to be killed. Now that is a shocking thing to say under normal circumstances, but in the case, in the, as I say, diabolical case that we have before us, that's the reality. Now, that doesn't give Israel carte blanche to do what it wants in the Gaza Strip, but I think the world, as it observes what goes on, needs to take this into account. And I might also add, the numbers coming out today from Hamas,
but
why on earth should we believe the numbers, honestly?
Even UNRWA, or rather the WHO, what was it, the UN agency?
Revised the numbers.
Revised the numbers, lowered it without even mentioning...
of course civilians were killed, but honestly, can any of us conceive of a more laughable proposition than to say that Hamas won't lie to journalists?
Perhaps what is being somewhat challenged here is the notion that time is not working in Israel's favor and is working in Hamas's favor.
I think that idea rests on the fact that hostages have been dying in captivity. No one disputes that. And therefore there is a sense of urgency among Israelis to bring the war to an end. Not just that, Israel is clearly paying a significant price. The obvious one is to its economy and society, all the disruption, but also diplomatically and in various global legal machinations. Israel is not a country that historically has been built for prolonged wars. This is the longest war since the War of Independence.
But you know, Mr. Perry, you were previously the bureau chief of the Associated Press here in the Middle East and elsewhere. Tomorrow morning, Sunday, what will be the headlines of the main newspapers? The amount of casualties at the Nusrat refugee camp or the 4 Israeli hostages released?
The question of what is news is an interesting one philosophically and for our industry. What's news for most of the media is what's interesting to people, and they also try to give the audience what they want.
But it's
So it will
the chicken and the egg. What is interesting to people? What
It'll depend where. It'll depend what kind of media. But I can assure you that the media will not ignore the large number of casualties that this operation entailed, nor should it. Nonetheless, the media also tends to go after drama and what is new. And the rescue of the hostages
is dramatic
is
and
dramatic,
is new.
and very sadly, it's new.
Yeah.
It's something different. So I think the main headline will be the rescue. But there's no way around it when the joy for those who feel joy subsides. We will remain with a tremendously difficult dilemma that Guy alluded to. Hamas is so diabolical that it is rather astounding that they retain support and popularity among the very, very Palestinians whose lives they have destroyed.
Quite literally.
In many tens of thousands of cases, quite literally. So this is a real problem. It shows you the power of brainwashing. It shows you the power of narratives. It also, I have to say, if we're not here as cheerleaders but as analysts of what goes on, it shows you Israel's difficulty that should require on the part of Israel some introspection.
Yeah.
A lot of mistakes have been made here to bring us to this catastrophic situation. And for the government, right now, there is a choice on the table that is genuinely excruciating. And all of us in the studio frequently criticize this government, and I think rightly so in many cases. But here, none of us can really say what is the right moral outcome, because the deal on the table, Netanyahu denies it half-heartedly, but the deal on the table, I do believe, allows Hamas to remain in Gaza for now. And I couldn't swear to you that this is a good idea.
What other leverage points are there vis-a-vis Hamas? And perhaps we've seen some in the form of not the carrots, but the sticks that were reportedly presented by the Biden administration through the Qataris and the Egyptians, telling Hamas leaders, if you don't say yes, it's not just, we're not just keep on going as is, you're going to face some sanctions. And by sanctions, we mean freezing your assets and deporting you from Doha, and also potentially arrests.
One is limited in the pressure one can apply to people who are, from our perspective, irrational and potentially suicidal.
But are they?
Some of them are, and maybe some of them less so. Hania, who enjoys a good life in Doha, perhaps isn't quite
less
so suicidal.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, clearly, there is no reason not to act opportunistically where you can. In the grand scheme of things, yeah, Israel brought back 100 and some hostages through negotiation, and it rescued 7. So it kind of looks like negotiation may be more effective that way. I'm not sure Hamas is feeling pressure from this rescue. They are frustrated. The bigger picture, I think, is whether Israel can afford to give Hamas what they want, which is an end of war scenario where they remain in Gaza. As I said before, I'm not sure it's wise to do that, but there certainly is an argument, because that would rescue the remaining hostages. It was useful in recent days to have Qatar threaten to expel the Hamas leadership in Doha. Whether that will really impact the rival of that Doha-based leadership, Yahya Sinwar and his tunnels in Gaza, remains to be seen. The freezing of assets is something that's been done already. I fear that the real pressure on Hamas would come only when the world understands that the head of the snake lies in Tehran. Real pressure on Tehran, potential future moves to enact regime change on Tehran. In the grand scheme of things, that might pressure Hamas. Look, one other lever, by the way, that maybe Israel will want to deploy vis-a-vis Hamas might be to formally offer the leadership exile in exchange for
reportedly
amnesty,
it's been offered in the past
publicly to create pressure on them. Maybe they should go to Tehran.
I think, look, the most pressure you can apply on Hamas is to strengthen their rivals. And the Israeli leaders have said that they're not going to work with the PA, even a reformed PA, which is an entity that Washington is willing to work with.
Yeah.
But given that there's no alternative for you to work with to strengthen and to solidify their potential prominence in Gaza, in the absence of that, all you have left is Hamas.
I have to say that, and this touches on a political, we're trying to avoid it on this day, but yeah, the fact that Israel continues to pretend like the PA and Hamas are somehow the same thing or equally as bad, and refuses to contemplate bringing a PA to Gaza, almost guarantees that the default alternative is leaving Hamas.
But
today.
what are we to expect on the diplomatic front?
We still see the mediators trying to push for a breakthrough, not only between the sides, but also meeting among themselves, the Americans, Egyptians, Qataris, trying to find some way to appease both sides. They have, in addition to these talks going on in Doha and in Cairo, trying to bring the sides, Hamas and Israel, to agree on this deal. There's also the avenue of the UN Security Council, which is also a way to press Hamas. Israel has indicated that it may not support the text of that resolution, but at the end of the day, we see that the mediators are really pulling out all the stops, especially the Americans, to try and pressure the mediators to pressure the sides. It's a multi-tiered mediation going on here, and at least from the Americans, we see
Everyone's
that they're putting a lot of their
on
weight.
the pressuring side. No one's the pressuree.
One possible thing that is rarely discussed is the fact that the ICC hasn't yet issued the arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant. It's the prosecutor Khan has requested them, but the judges haven't replied. Now, the judges don't have much of a legal reason to not accept the request, but since, in my view, and not just my view, this is a political maneuver, I wouldn't be terribly surprised to see part of the equation involving the request for arrest warrants going away if Israel in the end agrees to the ceasefire deal that we've mentioned. So many paradoxes here. I have to say, watching these videos of the celebratory nature on the beaches, Israel is, it really is a remarkable country. It is remarkably divided in some ways, but it remarkably doesn't want to be. And at moments like this,
What a beautiful way to put it.
the Israelis really seize the opportunity to show that, in fact, in some essential way, they are united.
Remarkably divided and remarkably doesn't want to be. Yeah, this is perhaps the Israeli paradox.